Hello there, how are you doing? Hope you are keeping well. Now this week I thought I would focus on something I've hinted at and talked about a little bit before, but I don't think I've ever gone into any detail, and that is the topic of Infratech. Now you may remember that came out when I was talking about 5G, also when I talk about cybersecurity, but I don't think I've ever gone into that much details about what it really is. Now I have this theory that you can take the word tech and put it at the end of pretty much any word and it will make something look innovative. I've talked about health tech, med tech, almost anything, sports tech, gaming tech, that's an obvious one, something tech, almost hashtag tech, and therefore it instantly becomes cool. And Infratech is one of those, but it is one that has a real meaning for me, both in terms of a lawyer and both in terms of my personal interests. Now, I'm sure you know this, I'm based here in Hong Kong. When I first moved to Hong Kong, the reason I was so attracted to it, one of the reasons I fell in love with the city, actually now probably one of the reasons it sometimes drives me nuts, it was how much it resembled Blade Runner, the movie starring Harrison Ford. Actually, both Blade Runners, actually. There's a new one from a few years ago. But walking around Hong Kong with the neon lights everywhere, the big screen, certainly parts of it, it's got that certain dingy sci-fi tint to it. That is something that, you know, I'm a big fan of speculative sci-fi, as I've said before, really attracted me to the city. And I always thought that Hong Kong would be one of those places that one of the first great smart cities where there's lots of automation. You'd be flying around in flying cars and vehicles that would pick you up and take you to your destination. All the trains, all the buses would be automated and it would be the future. But sadly, in many ways, Hong Kong is nothing like that. There is some phenomenal architecture, some phenomenal infrastructure here, but it's not always smart enabled. Now, what is one of the biggest sectors here, and if you've ever been to Hong Kong, you will know that, is the amount of construction that is going on all the time. There are cranes everywhere. We also have these rather cool, or health and safety nightmares, depending on how you want to look at them, although I'm told that they are pretty safe, scaffolding systems where you have enormous skyscrapers being built together, but the structure that's holding them up, the things that all the workmen are walking around on, is bamboo. It's been put together with bamboo with big green netting, and you think, is that actually safe? But apparently it is, and it's been a tradition here for many, many years. So there we go. Now, Infratech is essentially taking an infrastructure project, some element of infrastructure, it doesn't have to be in a city like Hong Kong, and using technology to either make producing it easier, better, more efficient, or how it's run and how it's managed and how it essentially works, embedding it with technology to make it more effective. And there's two real elements to this, and certainly there's a lot of construction lawyers in the firm where I work who are probably interested in the first section, which is where you take building projects and you embed essentially the day-to-day running of that project with technology. And this can be anything from something as straightforward as project management tools, which are revolutionary, but they're not massively exciting for someone like me as a tech lawyer, to actually embedding technology into how the project itself is run and managed. Now this can be anything from using cameras on site, tracking devices to monitor employees, not in a scary way, not in, oh, we want to make sure they're working at all times, but rather in a way to make sure they're not getting into accidents and they're working in accordance with health and safety laws and keeping safe, to things such as using exoskeletons, technology to build the projects. And I don't know if you remember the film Aliens. There's a big, I don't remember what it was called, this massive yellow thing where you walk around in a big stomping robot suit. They are a reality in some building projects, not just around the world, but here in Hong Kong. And I've had the pleasure of seeing people wearing them, thinking, gosh, I wish I could have a go. And that is very interesting, I think, for the construction people who are involved with the building of the projects, the people who get excited in terms of this is going to be a great new building. I like to see how efficient it can be put together. But for me, Infratech is the most exciting thing in terms of how, once a project is completed, it's actually run. And again, this goes back to the smart city thing I was mentioning earlier. I love the idea that buildings, projects, transport, any part of the way that a city or an infrastructure unit works, this is electricity power plants, solar power plants if they ever become much more of a reality than they are at the moment, how they're all embedded with technology, so they're monitoring at all times how things are taking place, how things are being produced, how the building is being used, and then they're using both the data they collect from that sensor technology together with AI if it needs to be, but it doesn't necessarily need to be, to make sure that things actually run a bit better. Now let me give you an example. I will Let me go over and use some graphics to show you how this might work. So this is a skyscraper, not necessarily a particularly exciting skyscraper, but it is a large building of which there are many in Hong Kong. I'm just using this as an illustrative example. I'm not making any statements about this particular building in question, so don't worry. Now, traditionally, this building had been built without use of any real technology. If it was just a traditional, let's throw together some concrete, glass and steel and build this enormous building that everyone can work and live in, then it's almost a bit of a dumb building. It's reliant entirely on maintenance checks that happen from time to time. If you've seen lifts being maintained in Hong Kong, we all live pretty much by going in multiple lifts every day. There we go. Then this all happens manually, not the most exciting way that it works. Lights have to be turned on and off. That's normally by someone going into a room and switching the lights on and off. Things as annoying as changing the temperature can involve a request to central management to get some guy who will then adjust the thermostat. All very frustrating and all very inefficient and using far too much energy. So that's skyscrapers of the past. Go to the future, an Infratech-enabled building. And when this is constructed, rather than it just being, let's throw together this glass and concrete, we will actually engage with technology and embed sensor technology into all elements of this building, be it sensors within the concrete themselves, be it light sensors in the building, sensors within the lift to judge vibrations, how well that lift is working, even sensors in the windows as to when you actually need to dim the glass a bit more or lower the blinds, and sensors monitoring how much water you're being used, even perhaps collecting water from the rooftops, perhaps even embedding solar panels on to try and make the use of electricity in the building a bit more efficient. And it becomes a more revolutionary thing. Once you have this, you can monitor when people are coming and going, what sort of technology they are relying on within the building, what energy they're using, and when you need more lifts in operation, so you're not running all of them at the same time, when you need the lights to go on and off. And you become not just a more efficient building, but you also become a building in which essentially you're saving money, saving the environment, and everyone ends up being very happy indeed. Now that all sounds cool, but it's not exactly rocket science stuff. It gets a lot cooler when you think, well, when you've got 5G technology, everyone's got their phone with them at all times, you could start linking some of the data being collected by individuals who are in that building to the technology within the building. This would mean, for example, it would learn when you're coming into work, when you arrive at the office, would turn on the heating or turn on the air conditioning just before you arrive, would make sure the lights are at the right level that you like, rather than just being a glaring mass of awful fluorescence all the time, making it much more of an environment that you would enjoy, even knowing when you're going to go to lunch. It's automation that you can actually do within an Infratech-enabled building is off the chart, and also very, very interesting. Now, the issue we have, at least the issue I think we have, is that whilst construction companies, construction entities are very, very good at building projects, they're relatively late to the game in terms of enabling them with technology. This is no criticism. I would say that the construction industry is one of the oldest industries, and in terms of building phenomenal architecture, that's great, but have not necessarily enabled themselves to really use tech in the way that perhaps other industries have, where they've been dominated with tech from quite an early period. Even in the labour force, and certainly in Hong Kong, there's an issue here with an ageing labour force, but previously it was just manpower being thrown into a building and it would be built effectively. Now they're seeing that actually with an ageing labour force and fewer people to actually work on a project, they need to use tech to make things more efficient. So it's changing. To be honest, a lot of the construction companies rather are finding ways to embrace tech and enable it into their projects. But a lot of them are finding that whilst they've got the goal there, they know what they want to do to make these buildings work, to make these construction projects effective, they don't necessarily know how to develop or produce the technology. Now, some construction firms, then fair play, they've created their own in-house tech division and they're working on generating technology. But the vast majority are essentially outsourcing. They're finding a partner to work on tech and making sure that that works within their projects. Examples that I've worked on most commonly are things in terms of producing ways to track equipment being used throughout a construction site, to partnering with someone who will develop sensor technology, which then will be deployed both in the construction of and in then the running of an infrastructure project. But there's an issue there. the two industries of construction and technology, and I perhaps know this better than most, are quite different in the way that they approach things. They have a different outlook on how a project should be run. They have a different outlook on what should be done, how things essentially should work and not work. There's also a big culture difference. I mean, I know it's very extreme, but imagine a typical Silicon Valley company compared to a typical infrastructure company. Or indeed, take it a step further, imagine a typical Silicon Valley company compared with an oil and gas giant who only recently has really jumped onto the innovation bandwagon. There are always culture clashes there and differences in the way projects are run. Now, I've seen from a lawyer's point of view, and this can be a bit of a headache, construction infrastructure projects have very long, very detailed contracts. Technology projects, whilst they could benefit sometimes from a very long, very detailed projects, often are a bit more bare bones. There seems to be a bit more in terms of trust as to how things will be run. Often misplaced. We do get tech disputes, plenty of those, but certainly not monitoring everything to the level that a infrastructure project might. You don't see quite so many detailed project plans, the level that you see in some of the smaller, at least, tech projects. It's often the smaller tech projects that finding themselves being shoehorned into an infrastructure project, and that can be an issue. I mean, fair enough, but what I do worry sometimes is that because there is this culture clash, some of those who would be benefiting from enabling technology into their infrastructure projects are put off by it. They think, oh, you know what, it'd be great to have some snappy whiz kid developing all this sensor tech, but it's too hard, we don't want to deal with it, it's going to cost more money to produce, therefore actually we'll just do things the way we've always done them. There's also often the issue that if we enable all this technology into a building, who's going to pay for it? Is the person who's engaged to build the building going to pay for it? Maybe they don't care, maybe they just want an asset. Certainly here in Hong Kong, assets such as property, big buildings, they are almost like gold bars, not the gold bar chocolates, but gold bars in brick and mortar form. And that's one of the reasons why there perhaps hasn't been a rush to actually value add by adding technology into them. But I think that will change. I think that more entities are realizing that infrastructure really would benefit from this tech, basically this tech vein of flowing through it. But I do question how far that's going to catch on. And what I do wonder is whether some of the technology companies are going to get there first. Now, I think about companies such as Apple, such as Google, who've built some fantastic campuses and have taken the lead in that. And you do wonder whether actually the infrastructure company of the future will be the tech company of today. That some of the old giants who are involved in infrastructure may find themselves in a position where they're undermined by technology competitors that they never ever saw coming. It's like the dinosaurs suddenly finding they're extinct because the meteor turns out to be, I know, giant Google logo saying, well, actually, we can harness all the data in your project and do something very exciting. And actually, no, you know what? We'll actually subcontract to you to build the building and we'll do all the legwork. I can see that happening. I can also see the fact that people don't necessarily understand, unless they're in the technology side of a business, the value of data. Now, the cool thing about an Infratech project, be it a smart building, which I've laboured on, or be it a smart power plant, or be it some sort of smart transport system. I love the idea of automated trains monitoring how many passengers are coming in, when they need to run more trains, perhaps laying on more trains to cope with passenger demand based on sensor technology rather than some sort of antiquated timetable system. But the amount of data that's being produced is hugely valuable. Data is essentially the oil of this generation, particularly now when oil seems to be worth next to nothing. And all of the big companies who've been huge, and I've mentioned this before, some of the largest companies in the last 20 years really don't produce anything other than manipulating data. Google is probably the most prominent example in terms of that. I know they create hardware and what have you, but again, their entire business is based on the creation of, the manipulation of, and the collecting of data. Facebook is pretty much the same. So you can see fights, and I've already seen fights when there is an infrastructure project as to who owns the data, who has the rights to the data that's produced by that project, and who can monetize and exploit that data. And that can be, I think, a bit of an issue. It's the thing that when you're in the negotiation room, when you're trying to decide on how a contract should be structured and who gets what, you can have the biggest stumbling blocks, because you'll probably find that the data in a smart city will end up being more valuable than anything in the smart city itself. So can it succeed? Well, of course it can, but I just wonder who will essentially be leading the charge. There's also the concern in terms of the interoperability of how Infratech assets work. And I've used diagrams to deal with this before, but let's go back and have a look at essentially a smart city with all of the various functions that would fit together. So let's try and make this as straightforward as possible. And this diagram is supposed to be the various bits and pieces, and it's by no means exhaustive, but the interconnected bits of a smart city. So you've got your smart power here. This would be all the power stations, the electricity generating things, whatever happens there. This is your smart transport. So this can be trains. You've got your smart buildings. This is the things like the office buildings, and smart homes, which I've kind of done separately because I'd like to think they'd be treated in a different way. That's purely a personal view in terms of that. And then you've got, this bit is kind of a catch-all. This is smart devices. This is individuals who actually are carrying and walking around with data. And the last one in the middle is smart government. Now, you're thinking, Haswell, what's smart government mean? This means you have an organisation who actually essentially has access to all of this data and can make a city work correctly. It's not necessarily a smart government, actually. It's more like a smart city planner or a smart mayor. It's like you, if you've ever been playing smart Sim City or City Skylines, where you're getting all the data and you're using it to make sure that your city is the best it can be. Now, in an Infratech project, every single element of this plan will be embedded with sensor technology and ways to monitor what's going on and be more efficient. That's in a perfect world. But what we actually find, and certainly what the case is in Hong Kong, is that the majority of projects, certainly at the beginning, essentially dumb tech, dumb infra rather than dumb tech, but infra without the tech. They don't have any sensor enablement. They're not something that you can actually use to collect data and monitor how things work. Now that's changing. But then the issue is that you find you may have your smart transport network, which doesn't necessarily talk to your smart office buildings, so it can't be sure how many people are all leaving the offices at a certain time, so it just assumes that everyone goes at 5:30 to go home, and that's when it needs more trains, when it may be, for example, because of the current COVID-19 crisis, that people are leaving in different waves. So the train system should be monitored in a bit of a different way, and there should be more trains at more staggered times, but it wouldn't know. So that's an issue. But then there's the issue that then when everything does become tech-enabled, if you've had arguments between infra companies and tech companies and no one can decide who owns the data, that nothing actually speaks to each other, that nobody actually knows what the other thing is doing. And I would say whilst an Infratech asset is brilliant in isolation on its own, it's only when it all connects together that it really becomes part of an exciting whole, that the smart city vision of the future is enabled. So that's a problem too. So essentially, all of this plan, whilst it's good to have each element on its own, unless they all work together, then it really doesn't work. It's not my vision of the future that I would really like to enjoy. The last piece of the puzzle is how people treat and view the data that is collected. Now, I've told you that there may be arguments about who has the right to the data and who is allowed to use the data. But what if, as I think is almost inevitable given what's been going on in the world in terms of collecting health data, for example, and I've talked about that before, people may object to having systems monitoring them every day, but yet you need an element of that to make a smart city and an Infratech project work. And I don't see a quick way around that other than gaining people's trust. But certainly the tech industry's got a long way to go. I think trust of the collection of data is at an all-time low at the moment and possibly only getting worse. It's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to whether these projects are effective and whether Infratech can be enabled. Now, it's no secret that in mainland China, where the government has a lot of control over data and generally the populace can't really object to the collection of data, that it's much more of a breeding ground, a place to thrive in terms of smart buildings, Infratech and smart technology. You can have a smart city built relatively quickly if you've got one entity controlling it and nobody can opt out. But I'd rather that we actually find a place where people trust that they will opt in, that they enjoy and see the benefits of a smart city, and that the data, let's be honest, is collected anonymously. They don't know, if they know that some people come to work at a certain time, and they can turn the lights on, the heating on a building, and make sure trains are laid on at the right time. That is all completely anonymous. It doesn't say, oh, Paul gets up late every day for work, turns up a bit late, goes up for an early lunch, then leaves early. Oh, and you know what? We'll supply this data to his employer at a fee, and then they can fire him. This is all not true. I don't do all of these things. I want to stress if indeed my employers are watching this. But there has to be some opt-in how that works. And this all means, so essentially, I know I'm technically selling legal services indirectly here, everything needs to be governed by very clear and very fixed contracts. We need to be in a position where the infrastructure company, the people building the assets, the tech company providing the technology to support the assets, the people who are running, buying and living in and within the assets are all subject to a legal framework that's easy for them to understand, and one that essentially means they all work together and it's an effective partnership. We're a long way from that. We are, I think, the biggest blocks to Infratech, apart from the fact that technology companies and infrastructure companies may not, they have the willingness to work together, but they may not necessarily have drawn the lines how that works yet, but that will come. But then there's also the users have to understand it a bit more. Some people, me for example, are very keen to embrace smart home technology, but I do worry about privacy issues. Others are very nervous. I met someone at the weekend who won't even use anything other than a dumb Nokia phone because they're worried about the data that phone might be collecting about them. So we'll have to see how it goes. But I'd be interested in your views. We've done here at my law firm a bunch of studies in terms of Infratech, but they all very much focused on how the tech sector and the infrastructure saw working together and what the benefits were. And that was all things like they prolong the life of an asset, they can essentially use an asset for more things, the data that's collected may make projects more efficient. They haven't necessarily looked at what it means when the smart city created by Infratech becomes reality and what that means for the people living within it and the data that's collected there. So I would be very interested in your views. Would you be glad to live in a, perhaps not a Blade Runner-esque situation, because let's face it, was a pretty bleak city. It was at Los Angeles. Actually, I think wasn't it 2019 that Blade Runner was set? So Los Angeles of the past. Not great. If it was Los Angeles, I could be completely wrong. State's my favourite. I'm getting this wrong, but never mind. But would you be prepared to live in somewhere that was a bit smart, perhaps like the movie Her, where things are more detailed, but people are having data collect and harvest about them and using that to make their lives better without worrying about essentially it's going to be sold to someone else? Or do you think we're fine the way things are? All I want is things to be a little bit more efficient, but I don't want them to be using sense technology to monitor what I do. I can manually turn the lights on and off. I can manually set the thermostats. I don't care when the lifts work as long as there's one there when I get in it. I'd be interested in your view. Do let me know, by all means, by either sending me a message, commenting on LinkedIn, or indeed on YouTube. And I think I might follow up this by trying to get some sort of construction lawyers to talk about what their view of Infratech is. But anyway, until next time, have a great rest of the week, and I will see you very, very soon.